Hey guys, welcome back to the Natural Beekeeping Corner on the Hive Jive. I am your host, Nathalie B, and today I have a very special guest that you guys probably already know. But for those of you who don't, he doesn't need a whole lot of introductions, but I will still let you know that Les Crowder is my friend, my mentor, my inspiration. He is the natural beekeeping expert by excellence. He wrote that book, The Top Bar Beekeeping Organic Practices for Honeybee Health. And I'm very thrilled to have him and have his time to share his expertise and his take on beekeeping and how we can use treatment-free as the hope, treatment-free beekeeping as the hope for the future of our bees and ourselves, actually. So we're going to use, I think Les mentioned that he's got an article that he just read on the natural selection of bees for mite resistance, and he's going to get us started on that. And he's got a little bit of a help in the background, I can hear, but hopefully you won't mind and bear with us as we're basically teaching the younger generations how to do natural beekeeping in a way. So Les Crowder, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to let you kind of get this podcast started today.
Okay, I may try if I have to go to a different room, but this was sort of impromptu, so they're here and there's nowhere else to put them. That's
right.
But they've had, it should be mostly pretty joyful sounds.
Yeah, I'm mostly grateful that you're on with us. So
well, thank you. Yeah, you know, I feel like this article, it was actually published in 1980. No, excuse me, in I forget now. 2020.
Last year.
So last year. But natural selection, selective breeding, and the evolution of resistance of honeybees, Apis mellifera against Varroa. And he goes into lots of data, lots of scientific studies in a sort of a global view. And he shows that there's a lot of evidence that honeybees can and have become resistant to the Varroa mite, in particular where we haven't used miticides, and that the places where the resistance is less is the places where we've been protecting bees that are not mite resistant. And when I read this article a few months ago, I thought, I almost feel like I'm going to be mainstream, and I've never been mainstream before. It feels a little bit like I'm at a loss to really know what to do next.
Well, and it's interesting to hear other beekeepers that have been pushing for treatments changing their tune slightly to the more subdued or not as strong words, and using the word sustainability more and more. I'm hearing a lot more talk about sustainability when it comes to beekeeping, and I think that's part of that transition, that change.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. And the thing is, the younger generation desperately is going to be searching for that sustainability. We can talk about it like, wouldn't that be nice? But as we get closer and closer to real either catastrophe or hope, we have to start making choices. And the younger generation is clearly saying we have to detoxify life in general. Beekeeping in my particular case, that's what I do, is I keep bees. So how do I detoxify beekeeping? And then we need to detoxify the rest of agriculture and textiles, clothing, and life, because we see that the toxicity that we thought we could get away with, we can't. It's kind of an aside, but I read an article recently where methylcellulose, which is basically like wood fiber, right? It's cellulose is just wood. And cellulose, by the way, is glucose or sugar molecules put together with two bonds. So wood is actually made of sugar. It's like starch, but starch is put together with one bond. It's easy to break, and so we can digest starch really well, but we can't digest wood. So they assumed, oh, this methylated cellulose, it's no big deal. We don't absorb it, so we can put it in food. And it was called an emulsifier. Now it turns out it has devastating effects, particularly in the colon, on beneficial bacteria that we have in our colon. And it directly is leading to colon cancers, irritable bowel syndrome. It's implicated in diabetes. And here we thought, oh, this is just something that is totally inert. They called it an inert ingredient because it didn't get absorbed, it just was passed. But what we're finding out is that we really need to detoxify and watch out what we put in our mouths and what we breathe. And as a beekeeper, that was always first and foremost in my mind, even as a kid. When I first was confronted with antibiotics, I thought, no, that doesn't seem right. Why should I use antibiotics? Beekeepers in Egypt didn't keep bees with antibiotics. So I'm not going to either. And then I felt sort of forced to, until I read an article that said we should be breeding for disease resistance. And as soon as I read that article, I said, that's what I'm going to do. And I set out to breed for, in those days, it was American foul brood that I was mainly concerned about, and to breed for resistance, which basically means breed from survivors. And so we can do that with mites too. But he goes on, he says, he provides evidence that the Africanized honeybees in South America and Africa, initially the Varroa mite was present in high densities, killed large numbers of colonies, but within 2 years, the numbers of hives, deceased hives, greatly reduced. Many colonies survived without treatment. This shows that natural selection can result in resistance in large panmitic populations. Panmitic meaning they're outcrossers. Honeybees are very outcrossing. They take their queen and go mate as far from the hive as possible to get her away from her brothers, to keep from inbreeding. And so once those genes get out a little ways out, they can spread continentally amazingly quickly because of the way bees would like to breed. When we breed them with artificial insemination and in closed populations, we try to force them to be more of an inbreeder. But bees' natural nature is to be outcrossers and breed with distant drones and mini drones.
And there's a reason for that, right? It's because they get genetic diversity and strength from that, and as opposed to that inbreeding that you're talking about, that's going to bring depression of the genes and just kind of weaker populations.
Absolutely, yeah. So that diversity brings in
vigor.
Yeah, lots of
hybrid vigor.
Lots of bees have the same mother but different fathers, and they're genetically distinct, and that makes them genetically better at certain jobs, and so they're able to be specialized and fill in all the niches that are needed. Whereas when you inbreed, you may not get as good a nurse bees or as good of wax builder bees, and the colony is much disadvantaged because, right. Excuse me, because of their inbreeding.
Right. It's kind of like I equate that to not having as many tools in your toolbox when you're inbred. You have smaller differences between bees, and they don't have all the tools that they need, all the various skills that the subfamilies may have to faster and better adapt to the changes in their environment, whether it be forage changes or weather changes, or even disease and immunity. They don't have all the tools that they need to fight those as well. Whereas when you've got hybrid vigor, you have that diversity of skills and all those tools in the toolbox that allow them to be more adaptable in a way, right?
Right. So that's a really good way to put it, because like if you have your toolbox and you didn't put a hammer in there, when you come to the situation where the hammer would be the quickest, most efficient way to do it, but you just can't do that.
You're going to take
Find a rock.
your
You're gonna have-
screwdriver. Yeah, I've done the rock.
yeah, a rock and a screwdriver. You do your best, but you're greatly handicapped.
Right.
And if ever there was a time when we need bees to be on their game at the top notch and ready for change, it's now, because the weather patterns are changing along with everything else. So we have all the pollution and the contamination nipping at our heels. And then we have the weather patterns changing. So honeybees have to be extremely adaptable right now.
So that's where that matters. And before we go any further, Les, I want to remind people we are basing our talks in actual scientific research. I know we do tend to get on our soapbox, and we try to keep the Natural Beekeeping Corner a little bit more, middle of the road, and understanding that not everybody has the options for them to not treat or do not want to or want to keep treating their bees. However, what we want to do in this Natural Beekeeping Corner, especially when I have you on and have the opportunity to discuss with somebody that does it day in and day out, and I do that with you as well, but you have that perspective over the last 35 years or so of doing it day in and day out, and I want to provide people with a different perspective, because a lot of the talk out there is talking about treatments or treating as we develop sustainability, and that's another thing that I want to discuss a little bit further is how can we talk about sustainability if we're treating and not giving the bees the opportunity to develop their own defenses. And I think that's part of what you're talking about here in this article, and that's why I wanted you to bring this up today. I realize that we're a little bit less mainstream than what the Hive Jive usually does, but to your point, things are changing and it is becoming more mainstream. And I think that by discussing all this, we bring a different perspective and we give people more tools and with more food for thought as to why this works and how to make it work for themselves. So with that being said, I appreciate you bringing up this this article. What else can you tell us about what that implies concretely?
Well, he concretely shows that the reason we need miticides in the United States is mainly because we've been using miticides. We have been breeding bees that are miticide dependent. We used to breed bees that were antibiotic dependent until fairly recently. It was most of your bee books said, give your bees antibiotics all winter to prevent disease in the summer. Now, medically speaking, that made no sense whatsoever. In other words, you don't give people antibiotics in anticipation that they might
Prophylactically
fend off. Yeah, it doesn't fend off disease in the future. If anything, it decreases your autoimmune system. In honeybees, the antibiotic used up enzymes that honeybees use to detoxify themselves. And then when they got toxic inputs from the environment, they didn't have those enzymes because we used them up with the antibiotic. So it was not doing the bees a favor. And now we finally realized, no, you shouldn't use antibiotics. So there's where I did become mainstream. For 30 years, I kept saying we shouldn't be using antibiotics. And people literally called me a communist for saying that. And now you're supposed to get a prescription to get an antibiotic. And we're saying, don't use antibiotics. So I did go mainstream. And now with the miticides, it's going to be the same thing. Because in the long run, you don't want to build an insect to relationship that is dependent on a poison that we can give them over long periods of time, because then we're fighting nature's resistance. When we first came out with the miticides, we came out with apistan. Fluvalinate was the active ingredient. And mites fairly quickly, in about 5 years, became completely resistant to fluvalinate. It just quit working. Then we went to coumaphos, a powerful organophosphate, but we had to promise to use it as an emergency. We had to be exempt from the ban on organophosphates. They were banned because they're forever chemicals. Once they get in your body, you never get rid of them.
Mhm.
Now, beekeepers had to promise to dispose of those strips as hazardous material, which is ridiculous. We don't even legally know how to do that half the time. And you can't afford to do it legally most of the time. You know, you put in a hazardous materials container and send it to Phoenix, Arizona to get it incinerated, which is not a good solution anyway,
Mhm.
right? Because it just puts it in the air. Hopefully it's carbon dioxide and water, but it's just a really dumb solution. So the younger generation is recognizing that we can keep dumping poison into the air and the water. We can't put much more plastic in the ocean, that we have to stop for their kids, our great grandkids. Speaking of
Speaking of,
grandkids, I know you have to be quiet, okay? Try to be quiet, please.
is that the 1.5-year-old or is that the 3-year-old?
Yeah, she just turned 2.
Oh, okay. Oh, that was her birthday. Very
It
cool.
was her birthday. She wasn't feeling well at all during her birthday, so we didn't really celebrate very much, but
That's okay.
she's all better now. So
Yeah. It's officially 2.
but they do relate me to the younger generation. I look at these little girls growing up, and I got it. She's just on a roll here.
Which is just helping.
They are facing a world that's very different, just in the screens available to them, in the toxins available to them. You know, we come out with a constant churn of new toxins all the time. And we have to find ways to work with biology. And the way I like to put it is that we had to go through the information age. In other words, we're in that now, right? We're awash in information. We're learning how to sort through it, even to use artificial intelligence to try to sort through all the information that we can't possibly view fast enough. And that's going to enable us to really get into the biological age, because biology is way more complex than we realized. Like even just studying the gut microbiome, turns out there's hundreds or thousands of players with different chemical outputs that interact with each other. And there's no way we could figure that out without computers. Right. So but now we're getting there to the time when we can start working with biology and come up with biological solutions to our agricultural problems.
Right, and to go back to the beekeeping industry, I would say that's why it's so important to learn about what is called integrated pest management, and learn all the tools that we need for ourselves to understand the biology of the honeybee, the biology of the pests and the pathogens, and so that we can adequately intervene before things get too serious. Meaning we can make sure we have the right kind of genetics, meaning we can understand and recognize the symptoms of problems early on before they set in and become too serious for us to do anything about naturally, meaning knowing what kind of biological controls we can use. There's some things that we can do to protect our comb from wax moths, eggs with the BT, the Bacillus thuringiensis, which is an organism that will keep the larvae or the wax moth at bay when we store that comb out of the hive. There's nematodes that can be used in the ground to control small hive beetle larvae. But most of all, I would say that understanding the biology of the honeybee, the superorganism, and the individual bees will help us really leverage that knowledge and be able to prevent the issues from setting into our colonies. And it starts with genetics. So I think that one of the most important readings that I recommend to people when they want to do and move towards sustainable beekeeping and natural beekeeping and treatment-free beekeeping and be a better beekeeper, whether they treat or not. Actually, every beekeeper should read The Biology of the Honeybee by Winston, because it's written from the perspective of a biologist, really, and from the perspective of the honeybee, and not from the perspective of a beekeeper. And that's got a lot of value, because it really explains to beekeepers how the superorganism functions and what makes it healthy and what's normal, and how to leverage that in their beekeeping practices for them to prevent problems from happening in the first place. The other aspect of what you were saying is that, to your point, with the colonies in Africa, in areas that didn't have the opportunity to use treatments for the years that the Varro mites kind of struck the hardest, it ended up showing a much faster evolution of the strength and the resiliency and the resistance of the bee population in the face of the mites. And that's, in Africa and in Jamaica and all those countries. And what Kirk Webster said, and what you're saying as well, is basically by eliminating or decreasing the pressure of the pest, we have really slowed down the evolution of the honeybee to develop their own defenses. We've made those mites stronger and more virulent, and we've weakened the bees by not giving them the opportunity to develop those mechanisms on their own. Yes, that would have been an investment up front for those beekeepers that were facing those problems. But if we had not been treating them, we would be way further along and we wouldn't have any problems with the Varro mites today. Something to keep in mind. Is that kind of what you're reading from that article as well?
Yeah, exactly. And to your point, like if you're a commercial beekeeper and you've got 10,000 hives on trucks going to the almonds, you want to make sure that there's nothing going to interfere with your good
paycheck.
You're right. Your bees are going to get inspected, and that's going to put a dollar figure on how much you make, and you want that to be as high as possible. So really, they have the least ability to experiment or to breed for mite resistance,
right?
Out of fear of the economics that they're in.
They don't have time to do this,
right? And they're in very tough economic. It's not a big money making easy deal. It's a hard work with lots of risk, and you could really lose everything,
right?
Or you can make some money. So, but a lot of beekeepers like myself, if I lose some bees, oh well, I'll figure other things and we'll manage. I have a very tolerant wife that puts up with and helps whenever she can. So we get by. But we're the ones that are doing that breeding for resistance. And let me just read the very last sentence on this man's abstract. He says, in large panmitic populations, meaning outbreeding populations, selective breeding can be used to increase the level of resistance to a threshold level at which natural selection can be expected to take over. And so that's what they've proved in South America, was that by not using miticides, they quickly began to help the honeybee become mite resistant on its own. And then natural selection took over. And it also means we have to know the biology of the mite. We need to know our biology. And the biology of the mite is that it could reproduce very fast. Apis cerana, it had to reproduce very fast because it had precious little opportunity. It could only breed in the very infrequent drones that they would raise during the bloom. And so they would breed at full tilt as soon as the mites would breed at full tilt as soon as there were some drones. And then when they made it over to Apis mellifera, they could breed in the workers. They bred at full tilt and they killed their host and they killed themselves.
Right.
So by learning to help mites breed for their own survival, we can tone down the breeding rate of the mites and increase the resistance in the honeybees, and we'll soon get a very stable population. And we have that in much of the world. So my fear of becoming mainstream
is realizing itself.
It's realizing itself whether we know it or not, right?
Which is great to have you on to discuss that, actually, because you've been saying all those things for 35 years now. I mean, you've been breathing and doing day in and day out. So you're basically you're vindicated. You're being vindicated. And I'm just kind of like, riding the wave of your teachings. So I'm not, I don't take I don't get any credit for all the natural beekeeping talking that I've been doing, but
Well,
I've seen you do it very efficiently, and so I believe my eyes,
well,
basically.
you're a younger generation than I am, and that means that you're further. In some ways, I look at it like we've kind of digging ourselves down in a hole with poison and pollution, and you're further seeing starting things further down in the hole than when I was, and your generation is coming around very better, and your kids and your grandkids are going to have very stark realities to deal with if we don't deal with it now, where we have to detoxify how we live.
So we do
Period.
our share, we do our part, and
Right.
then we try. Yeah. But listening to the wisdom of what happens in the honeybee colony and understanding exactly what makes them work and leveraging that is exactly what we're talking about. It's going to make better beekeepers out of all of us anyway. But I think that, some of the elements that maybe sometimes we don't think about are very practical applications of the understanding of the biology of the honeybee. And I know I've talked about it before, and you and I have discussed this before, but basically one of the big things that compounded the problems that the mites caused outside of the actual commercial beekeeping aspect of things and the stressors that the bees are exposed to and the promiscuity that are exposed to. There's also the fact that we're using things like foundation instead of natural comb. And we mentioned, you mentioned understanding the biology and the life cycle of the mites. And what happens is that when you do that and you look at the biology of the honeybee, you realize that by using foundation that's usually 5.4 millimeters or a different size, but usually too big compared to what the bees would naturally use in the colony, we are actually giving more time. We're making the bees bigger, but it takes longer time for them to develop when we do that. And therefore, the mite has more time under capping to reproduce and being able to get more mated daughters to get out of the cells. And I think that the difference in offspring generation is up to 3 mated females that come out with the mother mites when you're using foundation, and whereas when you're using natural comb, it goes down to 1.5 or 1. And so what happens is that you have a lot less explosive growth of the population of mites, which gives bees more of a chance to be exposed to the mite population and to be exposed to the viruses that they transmit, and to be in a way inoculated and vaccinated in a way, if you wish, if you will, by the exposure to not only the mite's physical pressures, but also the viruses that they transmit and the stressors that they create. But in a way that's more manageable for the superorganism and not as damaging, allowing them to more efficiently develop those defense mechanisms without falling for the mite overpopulation, right? So there's something to keep in mind that natural comb, for example, is a great tool to have in your bag, whether you treat or not. Again, I mean, you can still treat your bees, but the more of that natural beekeeping that you do, the better off your bees are going to be in the end.
Right, and we didn't realize how big of a difference it made when that foundation was chosen. They chose the largest size that they could get that they wouldn't raise drones in, and so it was just mainly based on bigger would be better. They could carry more nectar.
Right.
They're a bigger bee, but it turns out that they didn't realize it had an effect on the development time, and that you actually wind up with fewer bees per unit of time,
right,
because you increase the development, the metamorphosis time. And so we didn't realize we were interfering with their biology.
And their strength.
Right. So when you let them build their own comb, they build a variety of cell sizes, and then they have that variety of genetics they put in those varied cell sizes, and that even more increases the natural biological diversity of the individual bees coming out of those different cell sizes with those different genetics. And so if they're all stamped in the same cell size, you lost that increase in variety that we didn't realize. And now we know. And so, yeah, it's the same with back in the days of the antibiotic. Beekeepers used to brag about, I've got combs that are 40 years old. And they were sort of bragging about it. And now we know that's really not a good thing. That we should be culling our comb. It winds up storing toxins. It becomes bacteria and fungal infused in a bad way.
Right.
And it's not a good thing. So we had to learn to cull our comb, and now we have to learn to let them, build their own cell size.
I mean, a perfect example to what you just mentioned is I went to a hive that had the same comb for over 4 years that was already being produced by local beekeepers as a nuke that was extracted from their colonies initially. And it's just kind of, some of this comb was so dark, you couldn't see the light through it, even though there was no foundation. And the cells are looking like almost like tar in your lungs when you're smoking, kind of a thing. And the cells are getting smaller and the bees don't want to use them as much. And what happens is that your bees, the cells wax is lipophilic, and those cells that have been used for brood have layers upon layers of old cocoons and feces, and they tend to be loaded with toxins and basically viruses and bacteria. They're really unsanitary, and we're forcing our bees to raise their babies in those dirty cells. And then we wonder why the colony is showing signs of diseases, and we blame the mites. But it's not always the mites. It's sometimes the unsanitary conditions in which they are thrown. And then the beekeeper that was working those bees before me treated the hive with formic acid, and that's fine, but it didn't solve the problem. And the hive is still paltry, and there's a failure to thrive, and they're trying to raise a few babies, and it's just kind of like, I don't know if they're going to make it through the winter. But if they do, the good part of this is that we will use that, and give them new comb and entice them to grow on new comb and see if they're going to make it then. Because if they manage to make it through under those harsh conditions, which is basically harsh conditions, and so you had those toxins and those pesticides accumulation in the wax, and then you throw in treatments that also may accumulate in the wax and in the bodies of the bees. So I'm just kind of, it's a toxic soup that we're exposing them to. So
right, and the formic acid is also hard on the bees. So, and it may produce a long-term effect for a while because it's very acidic, for one thing. I experimented with formic acid many years ago, briefly. When the mites first came, they killed large, like 98% of the colonies. And so I was trying different things, and they said formic acid was organic. And I got a little bit of it in one of my eyes, and I decided, well, it may be organic, but it's terrible. I mean, it's fierce.
Okay, well, battery acid is organic as well, except that it's in concentrations that's so intense that it actually burns, physically burns, the chemical burns on people's skins, and that chemical burns as well from those hyper concentrated compounds that are potentially found naturally in the honey, like oxalic acid, but not 10,000 times more concentrated is not something that is innocuous, and it does take a toll on the colony.
Absolutely. And when you said something that we blame the mites, and so we would then try to treat for the mites. We have blamed the mites for a lot of things that were not the mites' fault lately. And I'm hoping that now that we're getting more treatment-free, is getting to be more mainstream, that we'll come to an era where we realize we've kind of gotten past the extreme of blaming the mites for everything. The mites are not helpful. I don't love the mites, but I don't hate them. Right, they serve a purpose, just like wax moths serve a purpose. Hive beetle serves a purpose, and we just need to learn to live with them And we have to stop blaming them when we put background toxins in the environment that are bad for bees. When we use systemic neurotoxins like neonicotinoids, and that's bad for our bees. And then we as beekeepers add to that with other things that are poisonous enough to kill the mites and hope that they don't kill the bees.
Right.
It's a fine line. If you get a little bit more poisonous, you'll kill the bees. So you might as well say you're using an insecticide in your colony to kill the mites.
Right, which
You're
also
hoping
does
it-
damage on the bees.
I mean, it's the same as we do with cancer treatments. We almost
Right.
kill the patient with the chemotherapy or kill the patient with the chemotherapy,
That's true.
trying to kill the cancer cells. So we have to, now we need to stop blaming the mites and start finding biological solutions. And one of the big things we need to work on is pesticides.
Right. And
And
to
we
your
can't-
point, if we are constantly blaming the mites and focusing only on the mites, we fail to realize that actually the highest likelihood of problems comes from poor queens and poor nutrition and poor conditions. So we fail to see the forest behind the trees, a bit behind the tree, and we're focusing on one aspect and we're not looking at the bigger picture. And I think that's where we probably have a great opportunity to learn to be more mindful about what happens in the colony rather than focusing on the mites and blame them for everything, because that's usually a symptom of an underlying problem. And in healthy, genetically diverse colonies with good nutrition and good sanitary conditions, you will have mites as well, except that they are not going to take the toll that they do otherwise. And so I really believe that mites are a problem, but just like wax moths and small hive beetles, they're a symptom of an underlying problem that if you don't fix that problem, no amount of treatment that you put into your hives is going to fix your colony long term, and it's not going to be sustainable, and it's not going to be ever resolved. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Right. I look at these things and it's sometimes easy to get kind of depressed, global warming, the big plastic continent out in the Pacific Ocean and all the plastic in the world and all this stuff. And it's easy to get like, oh my gosh, it's kind of getting heavy.
Children and grandchildren.
Yeah. But then I see that plastic is amassing a whole variety of natural creatures that are attaching to it. And I feel like nature will overcome, and nature is more powerful than we give her credit for. And that we have the most fun and make money and live in abundance when we work with nature instead of fighting nature with poison. And we have only really started using these extremes of pesticides since the 1940s. And I think that it's been an experiment that we've already seen. Nobody says you can be Republican or Democrat, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, whatever. Everybody agrees the world is toxic enough. Nobody wants to say let's toxify the world a lot more because there's plenty of room for it. And so we are all going to work on this. And I have a lot of hope that we're going to do a good job.
Right. And to your point, we have real life experiments. We've seen what 40 years of treatments is done and how far it's taken us, meaning not very far. And then we've seen what not treating at all is done and how much faster and how much more resilient and stronger the bees are when they haven't had. So there's already proof and evidence that one approach has worked better than the other. So that's something to keep in mind. With that being said, Les, I will leave you the last word. I like to do that because it's a treat to have you on. But I want to thank our listeners, and I want to remind them that if they have any questions, they can get a hold of us at Be Mindful Honey Farms. We do a chat with the mindful beekeepers, you and I, every Thursday from 5 to 6 Central Standard Time in the US. And you can follow us on Instagram at Be Mindful Honey Farms. and watch all the past recordings. We talk a lot about this kind of stuff, and you can ask your questions. You can send us your questions either for that or for the next Natural Beekeeping Corners. We'll be thoroughly delighted if we can help you answer some of your questions, if some of the stuff that we talk about needs more clarification. And in the meantime, I want to thank Les very much so for sharing his expertise and his time. This was impromptu. I kind of threw this onto him today, and I really appreciate the time that you took to get on with me and talk about all this stuff today. So thank you very much, Les, and you guys, I will talk to you next time. Les?
Thank you, Nathalie. Thank you. I'm always happy to talk about let's not poison our bees, and let's find ways to keep them alive without poison. They can live without us. We can't live without them, really. I don't want to try because I love fruits and vegetables. And someday I want to talk about how honeybees are such important pollinators of particularly trees, maybe the only real good pollinators of large flowering trees. But yeah, we just don't give up the faith. Try non-toxic living, and particularly non-toxic beekeeping. It can be done. And it's been good talking to everybody. See y'all later.
Thank you. You guys be mindful. See you next month. Bye.
Bye-bye.
This Hive Jive production was made possible by amazing patrons like you, and we appreciate your support. To all our Hive Jive junkies out there, you truly are the bee's knees.